It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. This week, President Mugabe of Zimbabwe had been put under house arrest by the military, raising much speculation as to what comes next for Zimbabweans. While Mugabe was allowed to leave his house later this week to attend an opening of a graduation ceremony at Zimbabwe Open University in Harare, where he was apparently dozing off, Mugabe has maintained the position that the only way he would leave office would be if his party, Zanu-PF party, voted him out as the leader. Now, a senior member of the Zanu-PF ruling party said it wanted him gone. If he becomes stubborn, we will arrange for him to be fired on Sunday and then impeached on Tuesday, he said. In contrast, the military said in a statement on national television it was engaging with Mugabe. It referred to him as commander-in-chief and said it would announce an outcome as soon as possible. Despite the military's claim that the detention of President Mugabe was to get rid of corruption, it is generally assumed that the real motivation was to prevent Mugabe's wife from succeeding her husband in the presidency. Mugabe had named her vice president just a week ago, ousting the then Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is considered to be a very close ally of the military. Now, joining me to discuss this is Horace G. Campbell. He's professor and Kwame Nkrumah Chair of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Horace is also the author of many books, including Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, and Reclaiming Zimbabwe, the Exhaustion of Patriarchal Model of Liberation. Thanks for joining us, Horace.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Horace, let's start with how you might describe what is happening in Zimbabwe and what motivated the military to take such action against Robert Mugabe and his wife.
The Zimbabwean working people have been struggling for a better quality of life for the past 20 years. They have been going on strikes and demonstrations. They formed political parties. They won an election in 2008. The election had violence against them. And the people who oppressed the Zimbabwean workers, the peoples were the Zanu-PF government of Robert Mugabe, along with the military. Inside Zanu-PF, the leadership had contradictions among themselves. Robert Mugabe, the leader of Zimbabwe for the past 37 years, is 93 years old. And there was a succession struggle inside the party over who will take over from Mugabe when he retires or dies. On one side is Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was the assistant of Mugabe from before independence, who have been associated with every repression and every looting that has gone on in Zimbabwe. On the other side is Grace Mugabe, who is the wife of Robert Mugabe. It was reported that 3 months ago, she slapped and beat a woman in South Africa. This is the woman who wanted to become the vice president and to be the next in line to be president of Zimbabwe. So what we understand from the struggles inside the ruling political party was, on one side was a section of the military and security headed by Mnangagwa and Chiwenga. On the other side was the wife of Robert Mugabe, 52 years old, and Jonathan Moyo, and others who call themselves the G40. And the struggle is still going on between them as to who will inherit the structures of the state to exploit the Zimbabwean people.
And what role might the opposition, the Movement for Democratic Change, the MDC, play in all of this?
The opposition has been weak politically and strategically. I think the more important question is what has been the role of the oppressed people who have been going on strikes, demonstrations, sit-downs, and the opposition, they are willing to enter into a national transitional authority. And at this point, I think this would be the best thing for Zimbabwe, to have a national transitional authority comprising of all of the political forces who have not been compromised by theft and corruption in the past 17 years. The reports we've had for the past year is that there's been a discussion and agreement between Morgan Tsvangirai, the head of one faction of the opposition, and Emmerson Mnangagwa about a transitional place in Zimbabwean politics. Now, this discussion does not include anything about bringing back the billions of dollars that have been stolen by Mugabe, Chiwanga, or all the rulers in Zimbabwe. So there has been a discussion that includes the opposition that has gone on, and there is a group of Zimbabweans who put forward the idea of a national transitional authority to rule Zimbabwe so that there are institutions which would end the violence and intimidation that has gone on under Robert Mugabe and Zanu-PF.
Horace, you mentioned the last 20 years as being difficult. People have struggled against Mugabe's leadership. Now, Mugabe has been in power for 37 years. What has happened in the last 20 years that leads you and the people of Zimbabwe to question his leadership and his policies?
Well, Zimbabwe emerged from independence in 1980. When Zimbabwe emerged from independence in 1980, it was the culmination of a very long political, military, ideological struggle against the Ian Smith regime. And at that point, Robert Mugabe and Zanu-PF, they were celebrated and supported inside and outside of Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwean Liberation Forces, they inherited an economy that was relatively well integrated with very developed infrastructure, very developed civil service. In the first 15 years, Mugabe lived implementing the policies going along with the West, but by 1995, they had started to implement the structural adjustment programs of the IMF and the World Bank, which meant that they were consolidating wealth in the hands of a few, and the poor workers and peasants were losing access to health, access to education, and social services. One of the most outrageous aspects of this is at that time, 2,000 persons were dying of HIV/AIDS, and the government was cutting access to health care. It was in this condition of intensifying structural adjustment and the IMF medicine on Zimbabwe that the war veterans in Zimbabwe demonstrated in 1997, 20 years ago. They demonstrated on the streets against Mugabe. When they demonstrated for a week against Mugabe, there was fear by the ruling class. And it was at that time that they decided that they would take over the white farms, take over the land so that they could get support from the people to present themselves as freedom fighters. But taking over the farms, which was legitimate, meant that the agricultural sector and the economy of Zimbabwe suffered. Why? From the time of the Russian Revolution 100 years ago, the question of agricultural transformation and the role of the peasantry was always central to how to move forward in an economy, how to get surpluses from the rural areas. What the Mugabe Zanu-PF regime did was to expropriate the white commercial farmers, but give the land to their cronies who were not themselves farmers. And so the agricultural sector deteriorated. The gross domestic product of Zimbabwe halved, and poverty intensified. This was compounded by the fact that the Mugabe regime went into the Congo and looted the Congo along with Kabila. So that for the past 20 years, we had the farm being taken over, the Zimbabwe army going into the Congo, and then with the finding of diamonds in Zimbabwe in the past 10 years. The Zimbabweans were mining $17 billion worth of diamonds, but these diamonds were stolen by the military and Mugabe. In fact, last year, Mugabe himself accused the military and other members of his party of stealing $15 billion. This is the context of the deterioration of the conditions of the Zimbabwean working peoples. And the Zimbabwean working peoples have been opposed to this consolidation of wealth and the ostentatious wealth that has been displayed by Mrs. Mugabe, her sons, and the cronies around Mugabe. But the military has always been repressing the people when they were fighting for better conditions.
Horace, you mentioned that there has been many struggles, many protests and demonstrations against the leadership of Mugabe recently. Describe the struggles that hardworking people have undergone during the Mugabe years that you think needs to be recognized now that there is an opportunity, and of course to have it addressed as well.
Well, the Zimbabwean peoples, the working peoples, especially the women of Zimbabwe, has had a long track record of fighting for better conditions. As I mentioned earlier in the interview, one of the debilitating conditions for the Zimbabwean people has been the conditions of the health services, the rundown of the medical facilities. And the rundown has been so bad that Robert Mugabe himself, in his ailment, has had to seek health care in Singapore and outside. So the struggles for health, the struggles for housing, the struggles for water, the struggles for food, the struggles just to live in Zimbabwe has been going on. But the government, in their opposition to the working people, in 2006, 11 years ago, they carried out an operation that moved nearly 100,000 poor workers out of the urban areas because they saw the urban areas as being a laboratory, a place for the opposition forces to get votes against Mugabe. Then the women and the workers, the plantation workers union, the women who worked on the farms, as we call these new farmers in Zimbabwe, cell phone farmers. We call them cell phone farmers because the land was given to them by Mugabe and the ruling clique, but they did not actually farm. But so they lived in the town and operated the farm through managers on their cell phone. The workers on those farms had no rights. What we do not have in the West is a systematic understanding of the degradation of the working peoples and the rights of the Zimbabwean workers.
So then what leadership is there that represent the working people that may emerge as a result of this crisis?
Morgan Tsvangirai, who was himself a trade union leader, formed a new political party called the Movement for Democratic Change. But the problem for Morgan Tsvangirai is that in the urban area of Zimbabwe, when the opposition was started, the first leader who ran in an election against Mugabe ran on a socialist platform. This young man was of a socialist party and he won the seat. That means the workers and poor people in Zimbabwe want an alternative to capitalism. What did MDC do? MDC removed him from the party because those in the party that supported neoliberalism and were aligned with the West would not have talked about socialism. So the opposition has its own problems. So we will not fault them for being ideologically limited, but the problem is, notwithstanding, they shouldn't be oppressed by Mugabe, who claimed that he was doing this because he was anti-imperialist.
How does Mugabe go from the man that supported the South African struggle to end the apartheid by supporting and arming the ANC, which he has been praised for by some quarters, to this man, the person you described, that embraces neoliberalism and exploit the resources and his people for capitalist gains?
Well, I think we have to understand capitalism and the role of accumulation under capitalism. And that once you have a political organization that is committed to exploitation of the labor power of working peoples so that one class of people gets rich, you have no escape from that equation of exploitation and accumulation of capital. So the Robert Mugabe may say anti-imperialist statement, may represent himself as being anti-racist, but Robert Mugabe was a die-hard capitalist who supported a capitalist class. And that's why when he expropriated the land from the white farmers, the land was given to generals. I must say that some some of the ordinary peasants did get land in Zimbabwe, but when they got land, they did not have access to seeds, to plows, to waters, and the infrastructure that would make agriculture viable. The cronies of Mugabe, however, the generals and the top bureaucrats, when they got land, they had access to state resources, to money from the bank to be able to run their farms. So one cannot say that there was not a transfer of land to the Zimbabwean people. There was a transfer of land, but the problem was not only the transfer of land, the problem how to make that land productive and to provide the resources for the society to be able to maintain a productive economy so that you would not have close to 7 million Zimbabweans running away from the country because of the level of impoverishment and exploitation in the society.
Were there any redeeming qualities, any redeeming error of Mugabe that you found worthy of the kind of reign he's had in Zimbabwe for some 37 years?
Well, I was present at the Zimbabwe independence celebrations in 1980. I was there when Bob Marley sung African Liberate Zimbabwe. I came from that generation that was part of the anti-apartheid struggle. And we supported the Zimbabwean working peoples. We did not support Zimbabwe for Mugabe, the generals, and Mnangagwa to get power. We supported the working people in Zimbabwe so that they could uplift the standards of living and become a beacon for the struggle against apartheid. But Mugabe, even in spite of his rhetoric, was always anti-people. The first sign of that was when he went to Jamaica and he told the Rastafari that the Rastafari were dirty and that they should cut their hair. That was the first sign that Mugabe did not understand the cultural outpourings of oppressed people. Secondly, the position of Mugabe on women and the rights of women and the way in which the leaders in Zimbabwe exploited, dominated women, and questions of inheritance and the questions of the rights of women inside the society. These were major questions. Thirdly, the question of same gender loving persons. Mugabe exalted in calling same gender loving persons pigs and dogs, and exalted in going around the continent bashing homosexuals. Fourthly, what Mugabe did to the workers in Zimbabwe. Fifthly, the pillaging and looting of the Congo. Sixthly, what they did with stealing the diamonds. So whatever we look at Zimbabwe, we look at the development of anti-people sentiments that developed among that leadership over the past 20 years.
Horace, what now? What should be the goals of the people that are open to change and some new direction for the country? What do you expect will take place? And you, who's been following the situation in Zimbabwe for so many decades, what now?
Well, I think the first thing we must do is to be clear that we can never support a military intervention in Africa. Under no conditions can the military be supported. And as I said earlier to you, this is an effort to hijack the working peoples, because there are many lessons for South Africa that the working people of South Africa, the workers, the poor farmers, they want to get rid of a government that came to power on the back of liberation but are now exploiting the people. So we want the people of Zimbabwe to organize themselves to have a transitional authority away from Robert Mugabe. Secondly, there should be an end to intimidation and the military should go back to the barracks. We should support the position of the African Union that the military should return the country to constitutional rule. Thirdly, we should end the police and the military intimidating opposition forces. Fourthly, those who are stealing the $15 billion that Mugabe talked about, the money should be brought back into the country. What we've heard on the international media for the past 2 days is that this will open up Zimbabwe for investment. This is not the challenge in Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe is rich. Those who have been stealing money from Zimbabwe for the past 20 years have billions of dollars outside. We should be pushing the position of Africa that the stolen assets in Africa should be returned, and Zimbabwe should be a test case. Fifthly, there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to outline the criminal acts that have been done by the Zimbabwean government against the people since the killing of 30,000 persons in Matabeleland in 1983. This is just the broad strokes of a reconstruction program that puts the Zimbabwean people. And the last point that I want to make is that the Zimbabwean workers, the poor farmers, the plantation workers, the students, they should have the right to organize themselves democratically without intimidation.
And if the military in Zimbabwe were to implement what the African Union is calling for, a return to the constitutional democracy that it is, and the military should step aside, how do you see that being implemented at this time?
Well, I think it could be implemented very easily because there is such a thing as the Southern Africa Development Community Organ and Peace and Security. There is a precedent in the Southern African region where the SADC Organ and Peace goes into a country and sets up an interim organization in administration. This precedent was done in Lesotho. What the progressive Zimbabweans have been calling for is a national transitional authority. This national transitional authority would bring together members of Zanu-PF and the opposition, along with other political forces in Zimbabwe, to have a transitional period so you could break down the oppressive institutions, the Electoral Commission, and the laws that disenfranchise the people. But the SADC government of Southern Africa, along with the African Union, would have to take a more robust position. One of the challenges in this process is that so many of the leaders in South Africa have been compromised by their business relations with Zanu-PF. The South African civil society and the democratic forces in South Africa, especially trade unions in South Africa, have a role to play in helping the Zimbabwean workers in this transition period.
So, Horace, what leadership is there in the country that may emerge, that can usher a new leadership in the country, new governance in the country? Describe what that looks like.
Oh, Zimbabwe is one of the most well-endowed countries in terms of political leadership and intelligence here. In fact, as I told you, that leader from the socialist wing of the opposition that won the elections in 2000, he's still active in Zimbabwe. The persons who signed the call for a national transitional authority comprise the list of the leading intellectuals, academics, and inside Zimbabwe, inside Southern Africa, and even among the 7 million Zimbabweans who are overseas, we have those forces who could lead Zimbabwe. What the West is afraid of is that the working people, the trade unionists, the women, the plantation workers have a voice in Zimbabwe. They want a transition in Zimbabwe that brings back Zimbabwe into neoliberalism, and where whoever comes to power continues to export money to the West and hold big bank accounts overseas. So we should be pushing for the Zimbabwean working people so that the military does not hijack the struggle that they've been engaged with for the past 20 years.
All right, Horace Campbell, I thank you so much for joining us today and enlightening us about what's going on there, and looking forward to having you back as the situation in Zimbabwe unfolds.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.